You probably think identity is something you're supposed to find, as if somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the expectations, beneath the confusion, there is a finished version of you waiting to be uncovered. A true self hidden under the wrong job, the wrong relationship, the wrong habits, the wrong decisions. And maybe if you think hard enough, heal enough, detach enough, rebel enough, you'll finally arrive there and say, there I am. That's who I've been all along. But that is not usually how identity works. Because one of the most unsettling parts of being human is that you do not begin life with a solid answer to the question of who you are. You begin with fragments, reactions, temperament, longings you cannot explain, fears you inherit before you understand them. A family system that teaches you what gets love, what gets punished, what gets ignored. A culture that starts naming you before you can name yourself. And then slowly, almost invisibly, you begin building a self in the middle of all that. Which means identity is not just discovered, it is formed. And for a lot of people, that truth feels both relieving and terrifying. Relieving because it explains why you feel so unfinished sometimes. Why you can be one version of yourself with friends, another with family, another at work, another alone at night. Why you can outgrow beliefs that once felt permanent. Why some parts of you feel deeply chosen, and other parts feel inherited, improvised, or forced. If identity is formed, then confusion is not proof that you are broken. It may be proof that you are still in the process. But it is also terrifying, because if identity is formed, then you have to confront a harder question. If who you are has been shaped over time, then how much of you is truly yours, and how much of you is just adaptation? That question tends to arrive quietly at first. Maybe you notice that you have spent years becoming competent, productive, dependable, even admirable, and yet there is a strange hollowness beneath it all. You know how to function, but you do not know if the life you are functioning inside actually feels like yours. Or maybe the opposite happens. Maybe your life looks chaotic from the outside because you keep changing direction, changing style, changing goals, changing your mind. And secretly what terrifies you is not instability itself, but the suspicion that there is no real center holding any of it together. That is the emotional core of an identity crisis. Not just, I don't know what career I want, or I'm going through a phase. It is the deeper feeling that the story you have been living no longer explains you, and the new story has not fully formed yet. That space in between can feel unbearable, because the human mind does not like unfinished definitions. It wants coherence. It wants continuity. It wants to feel that the person who woke up today is somehow connected to the child you once were and the future self you are becoming. When that thread feels weak, life can start to feel psychologically slippery. You second-guess your choices. You overanalyze your reactions. You compare yourself to people who seem so much more certain. You ask questions that sound simple but carry enormous weight. Why am I like this? Why do I keep becoming different versions of myself? Why does my life feel real in some moments and strangely borrowed in others? Most people answer those questions too quickly. They say you are lost, you are confused, you need more confidence, more discipline, more self-knowledge. But those explanations miss something important. Identity problems are rarely just information problems. You are not always suffering because you lack a label. Sometimes you are suffering because you are still negotiating the forces that created your label in the first place. That is where this gets more interesting, because your identity is not built in one place. It is not made only inside your head. It is not made only by your childhood. It is not made only by your choices. It emerges where several things meet at once. Your inner temperament, your social world, the stories you tell about your life, and the hidden parts of yourself you have not yet allowed into consciousness. In other words, you become who you are at the intersection of development, narrative, and integration. And once you see that, a lot of your confusion starts making more sense. Erik Erikson understood something that still feels radical now. Identity is not a luxury question. It is a developmental task. It forms through conflict. Not because conflict is a mistake, but because identity needs tension in order to take shape. You do not become someone by avoiding uncertainty. You become someone by surviving the period in which you are no longer willing to be a borrowed self, but not yet stable enough to feel like an authored one. That is why identity crises can feel so destabilizing. They interrupt the old arrangement between your inner life and the outer world. For a while, the roles that once organized you stop working. The good child, the talented one, the independent one, the rebel, the caretaker, the achiever, the one who keeps it together, the one who doesn't need anyone, the one who is always deep, always strong, always needed, always exceptional, always fine. These roles often begin as adaptations. They are not random. They help you survive a family system, gain approval, reduce chaos, earn belonging, or protect something vulnerable in you. The problem is not that you had roles. The problem is that eventually a role can start pretending to be an identity, and those two things are not the same. A role is what helped you function. An identity is what helps you feel continuous, real, and alive. So a lot of what people call finding themselves is actually the painful process of realizing that what once kept them connected to others may now be disconnecting them from themselves. This is why identity is never purely individual. Erikson saw that clearly. Who you are forms where your internal struggle meets the world around you. You are shaped not only by desire, but by recognition, by what your environment reflects back to you, by what your culture rewards, by what your family permits, by the kind of future your moment in history makes imaginable. That matters because it means your confusion is not always a personal defect. Sometimes you are trying to build a stable self in a world that keeps changing the terms. A generation raised to be visible, optimized, endlessly self-expressive and constantly compared will experience identity differently than one raised inside stable roles and predictable institutions. When everything is fluid, choice expands, but so does instability. Freedom sounds beautiful until you realize it also means responsibility for building a self without reliable templates, and that can leave you swinging between two exhausting extremes. Either you grip an identity too tightly because uncertainty feels intolerable, or you keep every option open because commitment feels like self-betrayal. One person becomes rigid, the other becomes diffuse. One says, "This is exactly who I am," and secretly feels trapped. The other says, "I'm still figuring it out," and secretly feels unformed. But underneath both is the same fear. If I choose wrongly, will I lose myself? Or worse, what if there is no stable self there to lose? This is where Dan McAdams adds another piece that changes everything. He argues that identity is not just something you have, it is a story your mind is building. Not a fake story, not a performance, but an internal life story that organizes your past, your present, and your imagined future into something that feels like a life rather than a pile of disconnected scenes. That idea explains so much, because most people think their identity is made of traits: introverted, ambitious, sensitive, avoidant, creative, anxious, independent. But traits alone do not tell you who you are. They describe patterns. They do not create meaning. Meaning comes from narrative. Meaning comes from how you interpret the things that happen to you. The rejection, the praise, the move, the failure, the loss, the heartbreak, the success that changed nothing, the friendship that saved you, the period when you disappeared from yourself, the moment you realized your life was being lived for an audience you did not even respect. Two people can live through similar events and emerge with completely different identities, because what shapes them is not only what happened, but the story their mind built around what happened. One person says, "I was rejected, so I learned I am too much." Another says, "I was rejected, so I learned not everyone can hold the truth of me." One person says, "I failed, so I am not capable." Another says, "I failed, so I was forced to build depth instead of image." One person says, "I changed, so I must have been fake before." Another says, "I changed because growth always makes old identities feel like costumes." The facts may be similar. The identity that emerges is not. This is why identity crises often feel like narrative collapse. The old explanation stops working. You cannot tell your story in the same way anymore. The career you thought would prove your worth no longer feels meaningful. The relationship that gave you a sense of self is gone. The beliefs that structured your world no longer convince you. The pain you thought was temporary has lasted long enough to alter your personality. And suddenly the plot breaks. You are still alive, still functioning, still answering emails and washing dishes and paying bills, but psychologically you are standing in the ruins of a story that can no longer carry you. And that is not a small thing, because human beings can endure a lot when suffering has a narrative. When pain fits inside a larger meaning, the mind can metabolize it. But when the story dissolves, suffering becomes disorienting. It feels pointless, unlocatable. You stop asking, "What am I feeling?" and start asking, "Who even is the one feeling this?" That is why the way you narrate your life matters so much. Not because you should lie to yourself or spin everything into inspiration, but because your mind is always editing, always selecting what counts as defining, always linking moments into patterns, always deciding what a wound means, what a turning point means, what a failure means, what a desire means. In that sense, identity is less like a statue and more like an ongoing act of authorship, not total authorship. You did not choose every chapter. You did not choose your nervous system, your early environment, your timing, your losses, your culture, your first language of love and fear, but you are still participating in the meaning-making. And that participation matters, because one of the most dangerous identity stories a person can tell is this: "This is just how I am." Sometimes that sentence is wisdom. Sometimes it is surrender disguised as self-knowledge. If "this is just how I am" really means I understand my patterns, and I can work with them honestly, it is grounding. But if it means I have confused my adaptation with my essence, then it becomes a prison. This is where Jung becomes important, because he pushes the question deeper than roles and stories. He asks something more uncomfortable. What parts of you have been excluded from the identity you currently call yourself? That question stings because most identities are built through selection. In order to be acceptable, lovable, coherent, or admired, you learn to emphasize some traits and exile others. You become the calm one, so your anger goes underground. You become the smart one, so your neediness goes underground. You become the kind one, so your ambition goes underground. You become the strong one, so your softness goes underground. You become the spiritual one, so your envy goes underground. You become the rational one, so your grief goes underground. This hidden material does not disappear. It waits. Jung called the social mask the persona, and that idea is almost painfully relevant now. The persona is the part of you that knows how to operate in the world. It is useful, necessary even. You need some mask to move through society. You need language, presentation, roles, boundaries, style. But the danger begins when the mask becomes so polished that you start mistaking it for the whole self. Then your identity looks organized on the surface, but becomes fragile underneath. Because the more tightly you identify with the mask, the more threatening your disowned parts begin to feel. Any emotion, impulse, desire, or truth that does not fit the image gets pushed into shadow. And eventually you may find yourself living a life that is socially legible, but psychologically thin, efficient perhaps, impressive perhaps, but not fully alive. That is often what an identity crisis really is. Not just confusion, not just instability, but the moment when the mask stops being enough, the moment when some deeper part of you starts pressing against the structure you built. You may experience it as burnout, sudden emotional reactivity, a collapse in motivation, a strange grief for no obvious reason, a hunger for change that feels irrational, envy that points to unlived life, attraction to people who embody something you buried in yourself, disgust toward roles you once wore proudly, a persistent sense that you are overperforming a version of yourself that used to work and no longer does. This does not always mean your life is wrong, but it often means your identity needs revision. And revision is painful because it asks you to do two opposite things at once. Hold on to continuity while allowing transformation. Stay connected to yourself while admitting that the self you were using may have been incomplete. That is why becoming who you are can feel like losing who you were. You are not only gaining clarity, you are grieving old coherence, old defenses, old recognition, old ways of being easy to understand. And people around you do not always like it when your identity changes, because they were also using your old self to stabilize their world. When you stop being the reliable one, someone else has to feel uncertainty. When you stop being the pleasing one, someone else has to face your boundaries. When you stop being the detached one, someone else has to encounter your depth. When you stop being the endlessly adaptable one, someone else has to deal with your real preferences. When you stop being the overachiever, someone else can no longer use your performance as proof that everything is fine. So identity transformation is rarely just internal. It rearranges relationships. It changes what kind of love you can tolerate, what kind of work you can sustain, what kind of self-respect you can no longer betray. And this is exactly why many people stay in half-formed identities for so long. not because they do not sense the truth, but because truth has consequences. Still, there is a difference between an identity that protects your life and one that prevents you from living it. So what do you actually do when you feel that crisis forming? When the old self is cracking, but the new one is still vague? First, stop treating confusion as evidence of failure. Confusion is often what consciousness feels like before reorganization. It is the mind admitting that the old map is no longer accurate. That is not a weakness. It is the beginning of honesty. Second, pay attention to the roles that exhaust you and the moments that make you feel quietly real. Not glamorous, not admired, real. There is a difference. Sometimes your truest identity does not first appear in your biggest achievements. Sometimes it appears in smaller moments of unforced aliveness, in the conversations where your voice changes, in the interests you keep returning to, in the people around whom you stop performing competence, in the forms of work that absorb you without needing applause, in the values you defend even when no reward follows. Those moments matter because they reveal the difference between social effectiveness and psychological congruence. Third, examine the story you keep telling about your past. Not just what happened, but what you have decided it means. Ask yourself which chapters became too powerful, which pain became your definition, which success became your cage, which rejection became your identity, which family role became your moral duty long after it stopped being yours. Because sometimes the most important shift is not changing your life overnight. It is changing the interpretation through which you have been living it. Maybe you were not always too much. Maybe you were emotionally intense in environments that could not metabolize depth. Maybe you were not behind. Maybe you were developing a self more slowly because borrowed identities did not fit you well enough to keep. Maybe you were not inconsistent. Maybe part of you kept sabotaging paths that looked successful but violated something essential. Maybe you were not fake for changing. Maybe change was the first honest thing you had done in years. That does not mean every impulse is sacred or every disruption is growth. Sometimes confusion really is avoidance. Sometimes reinvention is just another defense. Sometimes the language of authenticity is used to escape discipline, grief, repair, or responsibility. But that is why identity formation requires more than feeling. It requires integration, and integration is the real work. It means letting your story become more truthful, not just more flattering. It means allowing strengths and wounds to exist in the same self. It means recognizing that the parts of you that were adapted for survival are not enemies, even when they are no longer suited for the life you want. It means learning that your shadow is not proof of corruption, but evidence that your identity has always been larger than your self-image. It means understanding that wholeness is not perfection. Wholeness is inclusion. You do not become yourself by amputating everything inconvenient. You become yourself by creating a life spacious enough to hold what is true. That may include your ambition and your tenderness, your intellect and your longing, your competence and your confusion, your need for belonging and your need for separateness, your history and your revision of it. A mature identity is not a rigid answer to the question, who am I? It is a living structure strong enough to remain coherent while still being revised by truth. That is why the healthiest people are not always the ones with the most polished self-concept. Often they are the ones who can remain in contact with themselves while evolving. They do not need every chapter to match perfectly. They do not need every old version of self to be erased in shame. They can say, that was me and this is also me, and I am still becoming. There is immense dignity in that, because maybe the goal was never to finally construct a flawless identity and rest. Maybe the goal was to build a relationship with yourself sturdy enough to survive change, to develop an inner continuity that does not depend on performing the same role forever, to become someone who can meet life honestly, revise the story when needed, and keep moving toward greater wholeness instead of smaller certainty. So if you are in a season where you feel undefined, unstable, or strangely unfamiliar to yourself, this may not be the end of your identity. It may be the place where a more honest one begins. The old explanations may be falling away because they were too narrow. The old roles may be cracking because they were too expensive. The old story may be dissolving because it described your adaptation better than your soul. And the discomfort you feel may not be proof that you are losing yourself. It may be proof that you can no longer survive as someone partial. You are not formed in one revelation. You are formed in tension, in story, in conflict, in revision, in the painful and beautiful work of letting more of your real self enter the life you are actually living. That process is messy. It is slow. It is humbling. Sometimes it looks like crisis before it looks like clarity. But it is not empty. Something is happening in that confusion. Something is reorganizing. A deeper continuity is trying to emerge. One that is not built only from what the world demanded of you, but also from what your inner life has been trying to say all along. And maybe that is the real shift. Maybe you are not a person failing to define yourself. Maybe you are a person in the difficult process of becoming someone more whole. And once you begin to see identity that way, you also start to understand why some people feel the world so intensely, that identity itself becomes a deeper emotional experience. Why certain nervous systems absorb more, register more, carry more, and therefore struggle differently with belonging, overstimulation, and self-definition. That is where this journey goes next. Because once you understand how you become who you are, the next question becomes impossible to ignore. Why do some people feel everything so deeply in the first place? And that is exactly what we are exploring next in Why Highly Sensitive People Feel Everything So Deeply.